Hello, dear wanderers of the night. Welcome back to the Midnight Explorer, where we journey together through the forgotten corridors of time, seeking stories that soothe the soul and illuminate the shadows of history. Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and the stars begin their ancient vigil, I invite you to settle in. Perhaps you're wrapped in your favorite blanket, a warm cup of tea cooling beside you. Maybe you're watching the last light fade from your window, or lying in the peaceful darkness, ready to drift into dreams. Tonight, we embark on a journey that reaches back to the very beginning of human memory, to a time when our ancestors first looked at the green world around them and wondered, could these leaves, these roots, these flowers, could they heal us? This is the story of herbal remedies, not just the plants themselves, but the desperate hope, the careful observation, the tender care that transformed wild things into medicine. It's a story written in every garden, whispered in every forest, carried through millennia in the gentle hands of healers who refuse to let their knowledge die. So close your eyes if you wish, let your breathing slow, and come with me now back through the mists of time to where our story begins. A world unimaginably ancient. Not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years ago. The earth is wild in ways we can barely conceive. No roads, no cities, no hospitals. Just endless forests, vast grasslands, and small bands of early humans moving through a landscape that is both abundant and merciless. A child falls ill. Perhaps she ate something poisonous, or a wound has become infected, swelling with angry red lines that creep toward her heart. Her mother sits beside her through the long night, helpless, watching the fever climb. The firelight flickers across their faces, fear written in every line of the mother's weathered features, confusion swimming in the child's glassy eyes. What can she do? In this moment, suspended between hope and despair, human medicine is born. Not in a laboratory, not in a university, but in this desperate, aching love between parent and child, between healer and sufferer, between humanity and the green world that surrounds them. The mother remembers. Weeks ago, when she had eaten too much of the old meat and her stomach had cramped and twisted, she had chewed on those bitter leaves. What do the elders call them? And the pain had eased. Could those same leaves help her daughter now? With trembling hands, she gathers them in the pre-dawn light. She crushes them, releases their sharp medicinal scent into the cool morning air. She makes her daughter drink the bitter tea, holds her close, and waits. Just waits, as humans have waited beside sick beds for millennia upon millennia, hoping that this remedy, this prayer made of leaves and water, will be enough. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it was enough. This is where herbal medicine begins, not with a single brilliant discovery, but with a million small observations, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, from tribal elder to apprentice healer, from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain that stretches back to the very dawn of human consciousness. Archaeological evidence tells us that herbal medicine plants have been part of human life for at least 60,000 years. In a cave in Iraq, archaeologists discovered a Neanderthal burial site. Yes, our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals. And surrounding the carefully positioned body were the remnants of 8 different medicinal plants. Yarrow for stopping bleeding, marshmallow root for soothing inflammation. These weren't food plants, they were medicine. Someone who loved this person had placed them there with intention, with knowledge, with the hope that they might ease the journey to whatever lay beyond. 60,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment. Before writing, before agriculture, before cities or civilization as we understand it, humans already understood that plants could heal. This knowledge wasn't written down. Writing wouldn't be invented for another 55,000 years. Yet it persisted, treasured and preserved, deemed important enough to carry through the ages. How did they learn? How did those first healers discover which plants would soothe and which would harm? Imagine the process. A woman with a headache wanders through the forest, perhaps following a wounded animal that seems to seek out certain plants. She watches as the animal chews a particular bark, and something in her mind makes a connection. She tries it herself. The headache eases, or perhaps it doesn't, but she remembers. A hunter bitten by an insect notices the swelling and pain. In his wandering, he brushes against a plant that breaks his skin, releasing a sticky sap. Later, he realizes the bite where the sap touched is less inflamed than the others. He remembers this too. Over generations, over centuries, over vast spans of time that dwarf our modern concept of medical research, humans learned. They experimented, yes, and sometimes they paid dearly for their curiosity. Mushrooms that looked edible but brought death. Berries that seemed sweet but led to agonizing illness. The learning was written in tragedy as often as triumph. But slowly, painstakingly, a map began to form. A mental map held in the collective memory of each tribe, each clan, each community. This plant for fever, that root for pain, these leaves for the cough that wouldn't stop, those flowers for the wounds that refused to heal. And the knowledge was sacred. It had to be. In a world where injury or illness could mean death, the healers, the ones who held this knowledge, were treasured beyond measure. They were the shamans, the medicine women, the wise elders who sat at the center of the community and were consulted on all matters of health and well-being. Now, let us move forward through the ages, carried on the river of time to a place where human civilization began to take its first uncertain steps toward permanence. We find ourselves in ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, around 3000 BCE. The air is hot and dry. The sun beats down on mud brick buildings that cluster along the riverbanks. In the distance, ziggurats rise like man-made mountains, their stepped sides climbing toward a sky so blue it seems almost unreal. This is the cradle of civilization, where humans first gathered in cities, first developed writing, first began to organize knowledge in ways that would survive beyond a single human lifetime. And among the very first things they chose to write down, pressed into soft clay tablets with careful reed styluses, was their knowledge of healing plants. The oldest known medical text in human history is a Sumerian tablet from approximately 2100 BCE. It's small, this tablet. It would fit in your palm, but its contents are precious beyond gold. Inscribed in neat cuneiform characters are prescriptions, remedies passed down through generations and now, for the first time, made permanent. If a person has an aching head, one prescription reads, let him take the seed of the carpenter plant, mix it with oil, and let him smear his head with it. It will become better. Simple words, but they represent a revolution. Knowledge that had been oral, held in memory, vulnerable to being lost when an elder died unexpectedly, was now captured in clay. It could be studied, shared, refined, and preserved. Close your eyes and imagine the scribe who pressed these words into the clay. Perhaps he was an older man, his fingers stained with ink from other manuscripts, his eyes tired from years of careful work. Or perhaps she was a young woman, newly trained in the sacred art. Now, let us move forward through the ages, carried on the river of time to a place where human civilization began to take its first uncertain steps toward permanence. We find ourselves in ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, around 3000 BCE. The air is hot and dry. The sun beats down on mud brick buildings that cluster along the riverbanks. In the distance, ziggurats rise like man-made mountains, their stepped sides climbing toward a sky so blue it seems almost unreal. This is the cradle of civilization, where humans first gathered in cities, first developed writing, first began to organize knowledge in ways that would survive beyond a single human lifetime. And among the very first things they chose to write down, pressed into soft clay tablets with careful reed styluses, was their knowledge of healing plants.
The oldest known medical text in human history is a Sumerian tablet from approximately 2100 BCE. It's small, this tablet. It would fit in your palm, but its contents are precious beyond gold. Inscribed in neat cuneiform characters are prescriptions, remedies passed down through generations and now, for the first time, made permanent. If a person has an aching head, one prescription reads, let him take the seed of the carpenter plant, mix it with oil, and let him smear his head with it. It will become better. Simple words, but they represent a revolution. Knowledge that had been oral, held in memory, vulnerable to being lost when an elder died unexpectedly, was now captured in clay. It could be studied, shared, refined, and preserved. Close your eyes and imagine the scribe who pressed these words into the clay. Perhaps he was an older man, his fingers stained with ink from other manuscripts, his eyes tired from years of careful work. Or perhaps she was a young woman, newly trained in the sacred art of writing, entrusted with preserving the remedies of her people. The scribe works in the cool of early morning, before the heat of the day makes the clay too dry to work. The reed stylus makes soft pressing sounds as it moves across the tablet's surface. With each mark, thousands of years of human observation and experimentation become fixed, tangible, real. The plants mentioned in these ancient tablets are remarkable not just for their antiquity, but for their specificity. The Sumerians didn't just say, use plants for healing. They were precise. Myrrh for wounds and infections, thyme for digestive ailments, mustard for respiratory issues. These weren't random guesses. Each prescription represented generations of careful observation, of trial and error, of noting what worked and what didn't. In the palace gardens and temple grounds of ancient Mesopotamian cities, we find the world's first documented medicinal gardens. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of these carefully tended plots where priests and physicians grew their pharmacy beneath the brutal sun. Rows of aloe vera with its thick, water-filled leaves ready to soothe burns. Beds of garlic already understood to fight infection. Plots of poppy whose latex could ease even the most severe pain, though at a price the ancients also understood well. And the Babylonian king Marduk-apel-iddina II, who ruled around 700 BCE, maintained a royal garden that contained 64 different species of medicinal plants. 64. Each one labeled, studied, and used according to specific protocols that had been refined over centuries. This wasn't folk medicine in the dismissive sense we sometimes use today. This was systematic, organized, careful pharmaceutical practice. But these gardens represented more than just practical medicine. They were sacred spaces where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. The Mesopotamians believed that illness had both physical and spiritual causes, and their remedies reflected this holistic understanding. A priest-physician treating a patient with a fever wouldn't merely administer willow bark tea, though they did use willow bark, recognizing its fever-reducing properties millennia before we isolated salicylic acid and created aspirin. No, the priest would also perform rituals, speak incantations, call upon the gods Ea and Marduk, the divine patrons of healing, to bless the remedy and drive out the demons of illness. Was this superstition? Perhaps, by our modern standards. But consider what they understood. Healing requires more than just biochemistry. The patient's mind, their hope, their faith in the treatment and the healer, these matter too. We call it the placebo effect now, measure it in double-blind studies. But the ancient Mesopotamians already knew that belief could heal, that the ritual of medicine was itself medicinal. And in the quiet of a sick room in ancient Babylon, as a physician mixed his herbs and spoke his prayers, as family members kept vigil by lamplight, as the patient drifted between sleep and waking, between fever and lucidity, in those moments, who can say where the medicine of plants ended and the medicine of faith began?
Let us drift now, like smoke on the wind, south and west to the banks of another great river, The Nile, lifeline of ancient Egypt, flows through desert lands, bringing with it the rich black soil that will feed millions and nurture a civilization that will endure for 3,000 years. It is dawn along the Nile. The river reflects the pink and gold of the sunrise like a ribbon of silk. Along its banks, papyrus reeds sway gently in the morning breeze, and it is from these reeds that the Egyptians will create the papyrus scrolls that will preserve their knowledge for all time. In a temple complex in Thebes, a physician begins his morning rounds. He is dressed in clean white linen, his head shaved, his hands freshly washed. For the Egyptians understood cleanliness in medicine long before germ theory. He carries with him a wooden chest, beautifully painted, containing dozens of small ceramic jars and linen pouches, his pharmacy. The Egyptian physicians were the most renowned healers of the ancient world. Greek students would travel thousands of miles to study with them. Kings and queens of distant lands would summon Egyptian physicians to their courts, trusting them above their own healers. And at the heart of their practice was an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine. We know this because they left us the Ebers Papyrus. Picture this ancient document. It's enormous by papyrus standards, over 20 meters long when unrolled, covered in neat hieratic script. It was created around 1550 BCE, but it contains knowledge far older, remedies that the scribes themselves note came from texts of ancient times. This is a compilation, a medical encyclopedia representing perhaps 1,000 years or more of accumulated wisdom. And within its pages are over 700 magical formulas and remedies using more than 800 different drugs, most of them plant-based. Let me share with you some of what it contains, and as I do, let yourself imagine the gardens where these plants grew, the hands that harvested them, the patients who were healed by them. For skin conditions, the Egyptians used aloe vera, carefully splitting the thick leaves to extract the clear, cooling gel. They would mix it with myrrh and acacia gum to create an ointment for burns and wounds. Modern science has confirmed what they knew. Aloe vera promotes healing, reduces inflammation, and has antimicrobial properties. For digestive complaints, they prescribed castor oil. Yes, the same castor oil that was still being used as a laxative well into the 20th century. They understood its powerful purgative effects and used it carefully, mixing it with beer or wine to make it more palatable. For heart conditions, they used garlic. The workers who built the pyramids, those massive monuments to human ambition and engineering, were given regular rations of garlic to maintain their strength and health. The Ebers Papyrus contains numerous remedies featuring garlic for various cardiovascular and circulatory issues. Modern research has shown that garlic can help reduce blood pressure and cholesterol levels. The ancient Egyptians didn't know about cholesterol, but they knew that garlic kept their workers strong and healthy. For pain and inflammation, they had multiple options. Willow bark, which contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Opium from poppy plants, which they used cautiously, understanding both its power to relieve suffering and its danger. Frankincense and myrrh, those precious resins that were worth more than gold, which we now know have genuine anti-inflammatory properties. But perhaps most fascinating is how the Egyptian physicians thought about medicine. They didn't simply treat symptoms, they tried to understand the body as a whole system. The Ebers Papyrus describes the body as having channels, vessels that carried blood, air, and other vital substances. If these channels became blocked, illness resulted. Many of their herbal remedies were designed not just to treat a specific symptom, but to restore the body's balance and flow. In a quiet corner of the temple complex, away from the main healing rooms, an elderly physician sits with a young apprentice. They are in the temple garden, surrounded by the very plants they use in their practice.
The old physician breaks off a leaf of feverfew and holds it up to catch the morning light. "This plant," he says softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "is sacred to Isis, but it is also practical. When the head pounds with pain, when light becomes an enemy and sound torture, this plant brings relief. I have seen it work 1,000 times. But you must know how to prepare it properly, how much to use, when to harvest it. Too much, and it can cause mouth sores. Too little, and it does nothing. The plant holds its knowledge quietly, and we must approach it with respect." The young apprentice listens, nods, touches the plant gently. This scene has repeated itself countless times over the centuries. This is how knowledge was preserved, through this direct transmission from teacher to student, from experienced healer to eager learner. And yes, some was written down. We have those precious papyri, but so much was held in the hands, in the memory, in the careful observation of what worked and what didn't. The Egyptian medical tradition also understood something that modern medicine is only now beginning to fully appreciate: the importance of prevention. They didn't just treat illness, they tried to prevent it. They prescribed regular consumption of certain herbs and foods to maintain health. They emphasized cleanliness, fresh air, and moderate eating. They understood that a body well cared for was less likely to fall ill. And when illness did come, they had remedies that were remarkably effective. Modern chemical analysis of ancient Egyptian herbal preparations has revealed that many of them would indeed have worked for their intended purposes. This wasn't superstition or placebo effect, though those played their parts. These were genuine medicines, effective treatments developed through centuries of careful observation and experimentation.
Now let us turn our gaze eastward, across vast deserts and towering mountains, to ancient China, where a different but equally sophisticated tradition of herbal medicine was taking root. It is early morning in ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, around 2000 BCE. Mist clings to the valleys, and the first light of dawn touches the peaks of distant mountains. In a simple wooden house, an elderly herbalist prepares for the day. He moves slowly with the careful deliberation of great age as he begins to prepare his remedies. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, move with practiced precision as he measures dried roots and leaves, grinding them in a stone mortar. The sound is rhythmic, meditative, the soft scraping of pestle against stone, older than memory. The morning air fills with complex fragrances: the sharp bite of ginger, the sweet earthiness of licorice root, the bitter tang of chrysanthemum flowers. Chinese herbal medicine is built on a foundation text known as the Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. According to tradition, it was written around 2600 BCE, though historians believe the actual compilation occurred much later, around 300 BCE. Regardless of its exact origins, it represents one of the oldest and most comprehensive medical texts in human history. But what makes Chinese herbal medicine unique isn't just its age, it's its philosophy. While Western medicine, even in ancient times, tended to focus on individual symptoms and specific treatments, Chinese medicine saw the body as an integrated whole, a landscape of energies and forces that must remain in balance. They spoke of qi, the vital energy that flows through the body. They described meridians, invisible channels through which this energy travels. They understood that the body existed in relationship with the natural world, the seasons, the weather, the food we eat, the herbs we consume. All of these factors influenced health and disease. The herbalist in his morning preparations isn't just mixing medicines, he's creating harmony. Each herb has properties: warming or cooling, drying or moistening, ascending or descending. A good prescription doesn't just attack disease, it restores the body's natural balance. The Divine Farmer's Materia Medica, or Shennong Ben Cao Jing, compiled around 200 CE but based on much older traditions, catalogs 365 different medicinal substances, most of them plants. This number wasn't arbitrary: 365, one for every day of human suffering, suggesting that for every day of human suffering, nature had provided a remedy.
Let me tell you about some of these remedies, and as I do, try to understand not just what they treated, but how they thought about healing. Ginseng, the root of life, was considered one of the supreme herbs. The Chinese didn't just use it to treat specific ailments, they saw it as a strengthener of qi, a fortifier of the body's vital energy. Modern research has shown that ginseng is an adaptogen, helping the body resist stress and maintain homeostasis. The ancient Chinese didn't have these scientific terms, but they understood the effect. Ginseng helped the body help itself. Ginger was used for digestive issues, but also for expelling cold from the body. What did they mean by cold? Not just literal temperature, but a state of deficiency, of sluggishness, of energy that wasn't flowing properly. Ginger, with its warming, stimulating properties, counteracted this. And indeed, modern science confirms that ginger stimulates digestion, increases circulation, and has anti-inflammatory properties. The Chinese used ephedra, known as ma huang, for respiratory issues, particularly asthma. This plant contains ephedrine, which dilates the bronchial tubes and eases breathing. It's powerful medicine, so powerful that it's now regulated in many countries. The ancient Chinese understood its power and used it cautiously, always in combination with other herbs that would moderate its effects. They used chrysanthemum flowers for headaches and high blood pressure, recognizing what modern research has confirmed. Chrysanthemum has compounds that can lower blood pressure and reduce inflammation. But here's what's truly remarkable about the Chinese approach. They rarely used single herbs. Instead, they created formulas, carefully balanced combinations of herbs that work together synergistically. A typical formula might contain a chief herb that addressed the main problem, deputy herbs that supported the chief's action, assistant herbs that moderated side effects, and envoy herbs that guided the formula to the right part of the body. This wasn't random. Over centuries of practice, Chinese physicians had observed that certain combinations worked better than the individual herbs alone. They didn't know about biochemistry or pharmacokinetics, but they understood through direct observation that herbs could enhance each other's effects or mitigate each other's side effects. Imagine a Chinese apothecary shop in ancient times. The walls are lined with hundreds of wooden drawers, each labeled with elegant calligraphy, each containing a different dried herb, root, bark, or flower. The air is thick with mingled scents, medicinal, earthy, sometimes pleasant, sometimes challenging. A patient enters, and the physician begins with careful observation. He looks at the patient's face, the color and moisture of their skin. He examines their tongue, its color, its coating, its shape. He takes the pulse, but not just counting beats. The Chinese tradition recognized dozens of different pulse qualities, each revealing something about the state of the body's qi and blood. Only after this careful examination does he write a prescription. He moves through the shop, selecting herbs from different drawers, a handful of this, a few slices of that, several pieces of another. He wraps them in paper, presents them to the patient with instructions for preparation, usually boiled into a decoction, a strong tea that must be drunk while still warm. The patient takes the package home, and that evening the home fills with the strong, often bitter aroma of herbal medicine brewing. The patient drinks, grimaces perhaps at the taste, but trusts in the physician's wisdom, in the thousands of years of accumulated knowledge that went into this formula. And often, remarkably often, they got better.
Let us now travel westward to the sun-drenched islands and rocky shores of ancient Greece, where philosophy and medicine began to intertwine, where observation and reason began to challenge the gods for answers about how the body works and how it heals. It is a warm afternoon in ancient Athens, around 400 BCE. In the sacred grove of Asclepios, the god of healing, a temple complex has been built where the sick come to be healed. But something new is happening here, something revolutionary. Alongside the priests who still conduct traditional religious healing rituals, a new kind of healer is emerging, the physician. One who relies not on divine intervention, but on careful observation and rational treatment. Among these new physicians, one man stands out. His name is Hippocrates, and though later generations will mythologize him, call him the father of medicine, in his own time he is simply a dedicated observer, a careful thinker, a man determined to understand illness through reason rather than superstition. Hippocrates walks through a garden of medicinal herbs. He pauses beside a plant of henbane, its yellowish flowers and hairy leaves distinctive even among the varied vegetation.
He knows this plant is dangerous. It can cause visions, delirium, even death if used improperly. But he also knows that in the right dose, it can ease pain and help patients sleep before surgery. This is the key insight that Hippocrates and his followers brought to herbal medicine, the importance of dose and observation. Everything in excess is opposed to nature, he wrote. The poison is not in the substance, but in the amount. This might seem obvious to us now, but it represented a crucial shift in thinking. Medicine wasn't just about knowing which plants to use, it was about understanding how and when and how much to use them. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts attributed to Hippocrates and his students, mentions about 300 different medicinal plants. But more importantly than the specific plants, these texts describe a methodology, a way of thinking about medicine that would influence Western medical practice for the next 2,000 years. Let me share with you some of the herbs they used and how they thought about them. White willow bark for reducing fever and pain. Hippocrates recommended that patients chew on the bark or drink a tea made from it. He didn't know about salicylic acid, the active compound that would eventually be synthesized into aspirin. He simply observed that patients who took willow bark improved. Garlic, which they used extensively. Hippocrates prescribed garlic for a wide range of conditions: respiratory problems, parasites, poor digestion, and general fatigue. He was said to have recommended that athletes eat garlic to enhance their performance. The Olympic athletes of ancient Greece would consume raw garlic before competitions, believing it gave them strength and endurance. Hellebore, a powerful and dangerous plant. The Greeks used it very carefully as a purgative to cleanse the body of disease. They understood it was toxic, that too much could kill, but they also saw that in the right amount it could help certain conditions. Modern medicine no longer uses hellebore because safer alternatives exist, but the ancient physicians weren't wrong about its effects. They had simply learned through long experience how to use a dangerous plant with relative safety. Opium poppy for pain relief. The Greeks knew the poppy's power intimately. They depicted poppies on coins, in art, in poetry. They understood that poppy juice could bring relief from terrible pain and help patients sleep, but they also recognized their dangers. Greek physicians wrote about patients who became dependent on opium, who needed more and more of it to achieve the same effect. They knew about addiction, even if they didn't use that word. But Hippocrates didn't just catalog plants. He developed a theory of health and disease that would shake medicine for millennia. He believed that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health resulted from their balance. Illness occurred when these humors became imbalanced, and the physician's job was to restore balance. From our modern perspective, this seems quaint, even silly. We know about bacteria and viruses, about biochemistry and genetics. We don't believe in humors. But look deeper and you'll see that Hippocrates was onto something important. The idea that health is about balance, that the body is a system where everything affects everything else, and the physician's role isn't to attack disease, but to support the body's natural tendency toward health. Many of the herbs in the Hippocratic pharmacy were chosen not to directly combat specific diseases, but to restore balance. Cooling herbs for conditions thought to be caused by excess heat, warming herbs for conditions thought to be caused by cold, drying herbs for excess moisture, moistening herbs for dryness. In a courtyard garden in Athens, a physician sits with a student. They're surrounded by the herbs they use every day. The teacher picks a sprig of rosemary, rubs it between his fingers, releasing its sharp, cleansing scent. You must know not just what each plant does, but when to use it. You must observe your patient carefully. Look at their complexion, their eyes, their tongue. Listen to their breath. Feel their pulse. Ask them questions about their sleep, their digestion, their moods. The patient will tell you what they need if you know how to listen. And then you must choose your remedies wisely. One plant may help this patient but harm another. There is no formula that works for everyone. You must think, observe, adjust. This emphasis on individualized treatment, on careful observation, on adjusting remedies to the specific patient, this was revolutionary, and it's something that modern medicine is only now beginning to rediscover as we move toward personalized medicine and recognize that the same drug doesn't work equally well for all patients. The Greeks also understood something else crucial, that the mind and body are connected, that a patient's beliefs and emotions can influence their healing. They conducted healing rituals, not just because they believed in the gods, though many did, but because they observed that patients who participated in rituals, who had hope and faith, often recovered better than those who despaired. Hippocrates himself wrote, "Before you heal someone, ask him if he's willing to give up the things that made him sick." He understood that healing wasn't just about taking medicine, it was about changing lifestyle, diet, habits. It was holistic, addressing the whole person, not just their symptoms.
As we continue our journey through time, we find ourselves in Rome at the height of its power. The Roman Empire stretches from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, and within its vast borders, knowledge from dozens of cultures flows together like rivers joining into one great sea. It is 77 CE, and an elderly Roman gentleman named Pliny the Elder is working on what will become his masterpiece, Naturalis Historia, or Natural History. This encyclopedic work attempts to catalog everything known about the natural world, and a substantial portion of it is devoted to medicinal plants. Pliny wasn't a physician, he was a naturalist, a compiler, a collector of knowledge from every source he could find. And what he created was remarkable, a comprehensive guide to more than 1,000 plants and their medicinal uses, drawing on Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Roman sources. But Pliny represents something important in the history of herbal medicine, the moment when knowledge became systematized, organized, made accessible. His work was widely copied and read throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. For more than 1,000 years, it would be a primary source for anyone seeking to understand the natural world and its healing properties. Let me share with you some of what Pliny recorded, and as I do, imagine the empire he served, the vast territories where these plants grew and were used. From the cold northern forests of Germany and Britain, the Romans learned about mistletoe, which Pliny described as sacred to the Druids. They used it to treat epilepsy and other conditions, recognizing what modern research has confirmed. Mistletoe contains compounds that affect the nervous system. From the Mediterranean region, the Romans used lavender extensively. They added it to their baths. The word lavender comes from the Latin lavare, meaning to wash. They used it to perfume clothes and linens, but also medicinally to treat headaches, anxiety, and insomnia. Pliny wrote that lavender comforts the brain. From the eastern provinces, from Persia and beyond, they imported frankincense and myrrh, using them not just in religious ceremonies but also as medicine. Pliny describes dozens of medical uses for these precious resins, for wounds, for respiratory issues, for digestive problems. They were expensive, valued highly, and indeed, modern research has shown they have genuine medicinal properties, particularly anti-inflammatory effects. But the most famous Roman physician wasn't Roman at all. His name was Galen, and he was Greek, born in Pergamum around 130 CE. Galen would become the physician to several Roman emperors, but more importantly, he would write extensively about medicine, including herbal medicine, and his works would dominate medical thinking for the next 1,500 years. Galen built on Hippocratic theory, but expanded and refined it. He created elaborate systems for classifying herbs according to their qualities and effects. He wrote that each herb had a specific degree of heat or cold, of dryness or moisture, and that physicians needed to understand these qualities to prescribe effectively. For example, he classified garlic as hot and dry in the 4th degree, the highest degree, meaning it had powerful heating and drying effects. Therefore, it should be used for conditions characterized by cold and moisture, such as certain respiratory infections, but it shouldn't be given to patients with conditions characterized by heat and dryness, as it would make them worse. From our modern perspective, this might seem like an arbitrary system, but think about what Galen was trying to do. Create a rational framework for understanding how different herbs affect the body, so that physicians could prescribe logically rather than just relying on trial and error or tradition. Galen also did something revolutionary. He experimented. He tested different preparations of herbs to see which worked best. He compared different doses. He kept careful records of his patients' outcomes. He was, in his own way, conducting clinical research. One of his most famous contributions was the development of galenicals, preparations of herbs in precise formulas and strengths.
Instead of just telling a patient to use this herb, Galen would specify exactly how much of the active plant material should be used, how it should be prepared, how often it should be taken. He was creating standardized medicines, trying to ensure that when a physician prescribed a remedy, it would work the same way every time. Picture Galen in his pharmacy, surrounded by jars and bottles, mortars and pestles, scales for precise measurement. He is not young. He's in his 60s now, with decades of experience behind him. But his hands are steady as he measures out herbs, as he mixes them with wine or oil or honey to create medicines. A young apprentice watches, trying to memorize everything. "Why do you add honey to this preparation, master?" Galen looks up, patient in his teaching as always. "For several reasons. First, honey is a preservative. It will keep the herbs from spoiling. Second, it makes the medicine more pleasant to take, and a medicine that patients will actually use is better than one they refuse. Third, honey itself has healing properties. It soothes the throat, heals wounds, and has mild antibacterial effects. Every ingredient serves multiple purposes. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is arbitrary." This attention to detail, this insistence on precision and rationality would characterize Roman medicine at its best. The Romans were engineers, builders, organizers. They brought this same systematic approach to herbal medicine, creating the first true pharmaceutical industry with standardized preparations and extensive trade networks that brought medicinal plants from across the empire. Roman military camps always included a hospital and a pharmacy. The army physicians used a wide range of herbal remedies to treat everything from minor wounds to serious infections, from battle trauma to common illnesses. They kept detailed records, some of which have survived, that tell us exactly which herbs they used and for what conditions. And as Roman soldiers marched across Europe, they brought these herbs with them. Many of the medicinal plants now common in northern Europe were originally introduced by the Romans. Comfrey, used for healing wounds and broken bones. Fennel, for digestive issues.
Now we must journey forward through time, through the collapse of the Roman Empire, through the period that historians once called the Dark Ages, though they were not as dark as once thought. We find ourselves in medieval Europe, perhaps 900 CE, in a very different world. The great libraries of Rome have been burned or scattered. Many classical texts have been lost. The organized medical system of the Roman Empire has collapsed. But knowledge doesn't disappear entirely. Like a river that goes underground, it continues to flow, hidden but not gone. And where does it flow? To the monasteries. Picture a monastery somewhere in the German countryside. Stone walls surround it, keeping out the chaos of a world that has forgotten much of what Rome once knew. Inside these walls, silence reigns, broken only by the bells calling monks to prayer, the scratching of quills on parchment, and the soft rustle of robes as the monks move through their daily routines. And in the center of the monastery, there is a garden. Not just any garden. This is an herb garden, carefully planned and meticulously maintained. The monks have copied an ancient plan, first drawn up in the 9th century at St. Gall Monastery in Switzerland, showing exactly which herbs should be planted and where. 16 different medicinal herbs, each in its own carefully labeled bed. Let us walk through this garden together. Feel the cool earth beneath your feet, still damp with morning dew. Smell the mingled fragrances of dozens of different plants. Listen to the bees humming among the flowers, for bees were also kept by the monks, honey being both food and medicine. Here is sage, its gray-green leaves soft and slightly furry to the touch. The monks use it for sore throats, for digestive troubles, for fevers. Its Latin name, salvia, comes from salvere, to save, to heal. The monks believe it can prolong life itself. There is rue, bitter and pungent. They use it carefully. Too much can be toxic, but in small amounts, it helps with eye problems and digestive complaints. Pregnant women must never use it, as it can cause miscarriage. This knowledge is whispered from infirmarian to apprentice, carefully preserved. Over there grows tansy, its bright yellow button flowers catching the morning sun. For intestinal worms, they use this, and for various women's complaints. The knowledge is always specific. always detailed. And here, in a shadier corner, grows betony, which was believed to protect against evil spirits. Medieval people didn't separate physical illness from spiritual disease. They understood that fear and despair could make people sick just as surely as any infection. So plants that brought peace of mind were just as important as plants that fought fever. The monk in charge of the infirmary, they call him the infirmararian, is often the most educated person in the monastery aside from the abbot. He has read the few precious medical texts the monastery possesses, copies of Hippocrates and Galen, if they're lucky, translated into Latin. Perhaps a copy of an herbal by Dioscorides, a first-century Greek physician whose work on medicinal plants was considered authoritative. But the infirmararian's knowledge comes from more than books. It comes from observation, from experience, from the careful notes passed down from one infirmararian to the next. It comes from tending the sick during the long nights, from watching to see which remedies work and which don't, from trying new combinations when the old ones fail. The monastery infirmary serves not just the monks, but also the surrounding community. Peasants come with illnesses and injuries, and the infirmararian treats them as best he can. He might give a mother with a sick child some feverfew tea for the child's fever, along with careful instructions on how to prepare it. He might treat a farmer's infected wound with a poultice of comfrey and honey. He might give an elderly person with joint pain a liniment made from wintergreen and mint, infused in oil and warmed gently. These weren't just medical transactions, they were acts of charity, expressions of the monk's spiritual commitment to serving those in need. But they were also practical medicine, often quite effective medicine, based on centuries of accumulated knowledge. The monks also grew poppy for opium, though they used it very cautiously and only for severe pain. They understood its power and its danger. They grew cannabis too, using it for pain and inflammation, and recorded their observations carefully in their medical manuscripts. One of the most important figures in medieval herbal medicine was Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess who lived from 109 AD to 1179 AD. Hildegard was remarkable by any standard, a composer, writer, philosopher, visionary, and healer. She wrote extensively about medicinal plants, based both on traditional knowledge and on her own careful observations. Hildegard didn't just follow ancient authorities. She experimented, she observed, she thought deeply about how plants worked and why some were effective for certain conditions. Her writings on herbal medicine fill several volumes and describe hundreds of plants. Imagine Hildegard in her abbey's garden, an elderly woman now, her face lined with age but her eyes still sharp and curious. A younger nun accompanies her, taking notes on a wax tablet as she speaks. Fennel, Hildegard says, pausing beside the tall, feathery plant, is warming and pleasant. It contains a joyful nature, and whoever eats it drives away bitterness from their soul and opens their eyes to clear vision. The seeds should be collected when they're ripe, dried slowly and stored carefully. They help digestion, clear the mind, and make milk flow freely in nursing mothers. Every observation is specific, detailed, practical. Hildegard isn't just repeating what she's read in old books, she's sharing what she's learned through decades of practice, of growing these plants, of preparing them, of seeing their effects on actual patients. Hildegard also understood something that modern herbalism is rediscovering, the importance of preparing herbs properly. The same plant, she noted, could have very different effects depending on how it was prepared. Fresh or dried, raw or cooked, made into tea or tincture or poultice, the preparation mattered as much as the plant itself. The monastic tradition of herbal medicine would persist for centuries, keeping alive knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during Europe's turbulent medieval period. When universities began to form in the 12th and 13th centuries, it was often monks who became the first professors of medicine, carrying their herbal knowledge into these new centers of learning.
While Europe struggled through its medieval period, another civilization was experiencing a golden age of learning and scientific advancement. Let us travel now to Baghdad in the year 900 CE, to the heart of the Islamic world, where knowledge from across the ancient world was being collected, translated, preserved, and expanded upon. The air is warm and dry. The city bustles with activity. Merchants from India and China, scholars from Persia and Egypt, all drawn to this great center of learning. And at the heart of this intellectual flowering, we find physicians and scholars studying herbal medicine with unprecedented rigor and sophistication. The Islamic world had inherited Greek and Roman medical texts, but they didn't just preserve them, they improved upon them. They translated works by Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides into Arabic, but then they added observations from their own practices, from Indian Ayurvedic medicine, from Chinese sources, from their own extensive botanical explorations. One of the greatest figures of this era was Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, who lived from 980 to 1037 CE. His masterwork, the Canon of Medicine, would become the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe for the next 600 years. The Canon described hundreds of medicinal plants in meticulous detail. But what made it remarkable wasn't just its comprehensiveness, it was its methodology. Ibn Sina insisted on careful observation and testing. He developed rules for testing new medicines, principles that are remarkably similar to modern clinical trial methodology. He wrote, "The experimentation must be done with the human body. The time for the drug to take effect must be sufficient. The drug must be tested in its pure state. The quality of the tested drug must match the severity of the disease. The experiment must be repeated to confirm the results." Think about what he's saying here. More than 1,000 years ago, Ibn Sina understood the basic principles of clinical research. Use human subjects, give enough time to see effects, use pure preparations, match treatment to disease severity, and replicate results. These are the foundations of evidence-based medicine articulated in the 11th century. Let me tell you about some of the herbs that Islamic physicians used and how they advanced the understanding of these plants beyond what the Greeks and Romans had known. Senna, from the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, was carefully studied by Islamic physicians. They understood exactly how it worked as a laxative, what dose was effective, how long it took to work. They developed standardized preparations and wrote precise prescribing guidelines. Camphor, imported from Asia, was used for fevers, for pain, for respiratory conditions. Islamic physicians conducted careful studies of its effects and developed optimal methods for its use. Coffee, discovered in Ethiopia but adopted and spread by Islamic culture, was initially used as medicine before becoming a beverage. Islamic physicians studied its effects on alertness and energy, on headaches and digestion. They noted that it could help people stay awake for night prayers, but also that too much could cause trembling and anxiety. But perhaps the greatest contribution of Islamic medicine was in the field of pharmacy. Islamic scholars didn't just identify medicinal plants, they developed sophisticated methods for preparing them. Picture an apothecary shop in medieval Baghdad. The walls are lined with beautiful ceramic jars, each labeled in elegant Arabic calligraphy. The pharmacist, a learned man who has studied for years under master teachers, carefully compounds a medicine according to a physician's prescription. He doesn't just throw herbs together, he follows precise procedures developed over centuries. He knows how to extract active compounds from plants using various solvents. He can make syrups by dissolving drugs in sugar solutions. He can create ointments by mixing powdered herbs with fats or oils. He can make pills by binding herbal powders together with honey or gum. This was pharmaceutical science, sophisticated and precise. Islamic pharmacists understood that the form of a medicine affected how well it worked. Some drugs worked better when dissolved in oil, others in water. Some needed to be taken with food, others on an empty stomach. All of this was carefully documented and taught. Islamic medicine also made important advances in surgery, in diagnosis, in understanding anatomy. And in all of these areas, herbs played a crucial role. Islamic surgeons developed sophisticated anesthesia using combinations of opium, cannabis, and other herbs. Islamic physicians created complex herbal formulas for treating specific conditions, combining multiple plants in ways that enhance their effectiveness while reducing side effects. One particularly important figure was Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, who lived from 865 to 925 CE. Al-Razi was both a physician and a philosopher, and he brought a critical, questioning attitude to medicine that was ahead of its time. He wasn't content to simply accept the teachings of ancient authorities. He questioned them, tested them, and wasn't afraid to disagree with Galen or Hippocrates if his own observations suggested they were wrong. He wrote about the importance of taking detailed patient histories, of considering all symptoms before prescribing, and following up with patients to see if treatments were working. In his writings about herbal medicine, Al-Razi emphasized practicality. He wrote that physicians should use the simplest, most readily available remedies first, resorting to complex or expensive treatments only if simpler ones failed. He was concerned about the expense of medicine for poor patients and advocated for using local, inexpensive herbs whenever possible. If the physician is able to treat with foodstuffs, then do not treat with medicines. If the physician is able to treat with simple drugs, then do not treat with compound drugs. This emphasis on simplicity and accessibility showed a deep wisdom and compassion that transcended mere technical knowledge. Islamic medicine also served as a bridge, carrying medical knowledge between East and West. Through Islamic physicians and scholars, Greek medical texts were preserved and eventually transmitted back to Europe during the Renaissance. Indian and Chinese medical knowledge traveled west through Islamic territories. New plants from Asia and Africa were studied and incorporated into Islamic medicine, and from there spread to Europe. Now let us leap forward in time to Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Renaissance, the rebirth, is transforming European culture. Ancient texts are being rediscovered, questioned, and built upon. The printing press has been invented, making it possible to spread knowledge more quickly and accurately than ever before. And in this atmosphere of intellectual ferment, the study of medicinal plants is being revolutionized. It is 1530. And in the Swiss city of Basel, a doctor walks through the countryside gathering plants. His name is Paracelsus, and he is about to turn medical theory upside down. Paracelsus is not a man who follows traditions quietly. He has publicly burned the books of Galen and Avicenna, shocking the medical establishment. He insists on lecturing in German rather than Latin, making knowledge accessible to common people. And his ideas about herbal medicine are radical. All things are poison, Paracelsus declares, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes the thing not a poison. This is revolutionary. Instead of thinking of plants as simply good or bad, as healing or harmful, Paracelsus argues that any substance can be medicine or poison depending on how much you use. The ancient physicians knew this, of course, but Paracelsus makes it central to his philosophy of medicine. He also has a theory he calls the doctrine of signatures. The idea is that plants bear signs, signatures, that indicate what they can heal. A plant with heart-shaped leaves might be good for heart conditions. A plant with yellow sap might be good for jaundice. A plant that grows in damp places might be good for treating diseases associated with dampness. From our modern perspective, this seems like magical thinking. And indeed, the doctrine of signatures doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny. But here's the interesting thing. Sometimes it worked. Not because plants really bore signs of their uses, but because careful observation over centuries had noticed that certain plants with distinctive features did have specific effects, and the signature was a memory aid, a way to remember which plant did what. But the real revolution in Renaissance herbal medicine wasn't in theory, it was in observation and documentation. For the first time, physicians and naturalists were creating detailed, accurate illustrations of plants, printed in books that could be widely distributed. One of the most important of these books was The Herbal by John Gerard, published in London in 1597. Gerard describes nearly 2,000 different plants, many of them medicinal, with detailed descriptions and woodcut illustrations. Picture Gerard in his garden in London, carefully cultivating plants from around the world. He grows English natives like foxglove and lungwort, alongside exotic imports like tobacco from the Americas. Each plant is labeled, studied, drawn. Gerard writes down everything he observes: when the plant flowers, what conditions it prefers, what it's used for medicinally. This might seem simple to us now, but it represented a crucial shift. Instead of relying solely on ancient authorities, Renaissance herbalists were going back to direct observation. They were looking at plants with their own eyes, growing them with their own hands, testing their effects, and recording the results. The discovery of the Americas added hundreds of new medicinal plants to European knowledge. Explorers and colonizers brought back plants that Native Americans had used for centuries. Cinchona bark from Peru, which contained quinine and could treat malaria. Coca from South America, which would eventually give us cocaine and then local anesthetics. Tobacco, initially used medicinally for everything from headaches to snake bites, though its medicinal uses were greatly exaggerated. But this exchange went both ways. European plants were brought to the Americas, sometimes intentionally as colonizers brought their medicinal herbs with them, sometimes accidentally as seeds traveled in cargo holds and took root in new soil. African plants came too, brought by enslaved people who carefully preserved the seeds of herbs that held both medical and spiritual significance. The 16th century also saw the emergence of university-trained physicians who specialized in botany. These were men like Leonhard Fuchs in Germany, after whom the fuchsia flower is named, who tried to bring scientific rigor to the study of plants. They classified plants systematically, described them carefully, and distinguished between different species that earlier herbalists had confused. In university botanical gardens, the first were established in Padua and Pisa in the 1540s, students could study living plants rather than just dried specimens or illustrations. They could see how plants grew, observe their seasonal changes, and learn to identify them accurately. But while academic physicians were systematizing herbal knowledge in universities, a parallel tradition continued among common people. Village wise women, midwives, and folk healers continued to gather and use medicinal herbs much as their ancestors had done for centuries. They often had deep practical knowledge of local plants, passed down through oral tradition. There was sometimes tension between these two worlds, the university-trained physician with his books and theories, and the folk healer with her practical experience. The physicians sometimes dismissed the folk healers as ignorant. The folk healers sometimes resented the physicians as arrogant men who didn't really understand healing. But the truth is, both had valuable knowledge. The physicians had access to texts and learning that gave them a broader perspective. The folk healers had deep practical experience that no amount of book learning could replace. The best medicine happened when these two traditions could speak to each other, when theoretical knowledge and practical experience could combine. As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, herbal medicine becomes entangled with empire, colonization, and the dark history of exploitation that characterized this era. European powers are establishing colonies around the world, and wherever they go, they encounter new medicinal plants. But they also encounter indigenous peoples who have sophisticated knowledge of these plants, knowledge developed over thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. Let me take you to the Amazon rainforest in 1700. A Jesuit missionary has fallen ill with a fever, the terrible recurring fever that Europeans call ague, and we now know as malaria. He is delirious, burning with heat one moment, shivering with cold the next. His companions fear he will die. An indigenous healer approaches with a decoction made from the bark of a local tree. The Quechua people call it fever tree bark. The healer has prepared it carefully, boiling the bitter bark in water until it creates a dark brown liquid. She gives it to the sick priest, and remarkably, within days, his fever breaks. He recovers. This bark, cinchona, contains quinine, one of the most important drugs in human history. It would make it possible for Europeans to survive in tropical regions, changing the course of history. For better and worse. Mostly worse for the indigenous peoples who were colonized. The Jesuits brought cinchona bark back to Europe, where it was called Jesuits' bark or Peruvian bark. It was expensive, valuable, fought over. Eventually, cinchona trees were stolen from South America and planted in colonial plantations in Java, in India, so that European powers wouldn't have to depend on South American sources. This pattern repeated itself across the globe. Indigenous knowledge of medicinal plants was extracted, often without credit or compensation. Plants were taken from their native lands and cultivated in colonial plantations. The people who had developed this knowledge over generations were rarely benefited and were often harmed by this process. In India, the British systematically documented Indian medicinal plants and practices, creating massive reference works. But they did so while simultaneously undermining traditional Indian medicine, portraying it as superstitious and backward compared to European medicine. They wanted the knowledge, but they didn't want to acknowledge its value or respect its sources. In Africa, traditional healers had used plants like African sherry bark for various conditions. European colonizers took note, extracted the plants, studied them in European laboratories, and eventually developed drugs based on these plants, but the African healers who had originally discovered their uses received nothing. This is a dark chapter in the history of herbal medicine, one we shouldn't shy away from. The knowledge that indigenous peoples had carefully developed and preserved was treated as a resource to be extracted, just like gold or timber or spices. But even in this era of exploitation, genuine exchange and learning sometimes occurred. Some European physicians and naturalists approached indigenous medicine with respect and curiosity. They learned from native healers, documented their practices carefully, and acknowledged their expertise. One such figure was Maria Sibylla Merian, a Dutch naturalist who traveled to Suriname in 1699. Merian not only documented the insects and plants of the region with exquisite illustrations, but she also carefully recorded the medicinal uses that indigenous and enslaved African people made of local plants. She learned from them, acknowledged them as her teachers, and preserved their knowledge in her writings. In North America, European colonists learned from Native American herbalists. The Shakers, a religious community in America, became famous for their herb gardens and their preparations of medicinal herbs. But much of their knowledge came from Native American sources, though this wasn't always acknowledged. Native Americans taught colonists about echinacea for immune support, golden seal for infections, black cohosh for women's health issues, and dozens of other plants. Some of this knowledge was documented and preserved, some was stolen and exploited. Much was simply lost, as Native American communities were decimated by disease and displacement. By the 18th century, European and American herbalists had access to medicinal plants from around the world. A physician or apothecary in London or Boston might stock Chinese herbs, African plants, South American barks, Indian spices, and European natives. This was unprecedented in human history. Never before had such diverse botanical knowledge been concentrated in one place. But there was a problem. As the variety and complexity of available medicinal plants increased, it became harder to standardize treatments. Different samples of the same plant might have very different strengths, depending on where they were grown, when they were harvested, how they were stored. A remedy that worked wonderfully with one batch of herbs might be ineffective or even dangerous with another batch. This variability would eventually lead physicians to seek more standardized, purified preparations. Instead of using the whole plant, they began to try to isolate specific active compounds that could be measured, standardized, and given in consistent doses. This shift towards isolated compounds would ultimately lead to modern pharmaceutical medicine. But in the 18th century, it was still in the future. Most medicine was still herbal medicine, and most physicians still relied primarily on plant-based remedies. We now find ourselves in the early 19th century, at a moment of profound transformation in medicine. The scientific revolution is in full swing. Chemistry is emerging as a rigorous discipline, and physicians are beginning to ask a new question. Instead of using the whole plant, can we extract and purify the specific substance that causes the plant's medicinal effects? It is 1804 in Germany. A young pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner is working with opium, the dried latex of the poppy plant. Opium has been used for millennia to relieve pain, but it's unpredictable. One batch might be much stronger than another, making proper dosing difficult and dangerous. Serturner suspects that opium contains a specific substance responsible for its effects. He performs a series of careful chemical extractions, and finally, he succeeds in isolating pure crystals of what he calls morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This is morphine, the first pure drug ever extracted from a plant. Sir Turner doesn't fully realize it, but he has just changed medicine forever. He has shown that plants contain specific chemical compounds that can be isolated, purified, standardized, and used as medicines. Over the next few decades, chemists raced to isolate active compounds from medicinal plants. In 1820, quinine is purified from cinchona bark. In 1832, codeine is extracted from opium. In 1860, cocaine is isolated from coca leaves. Each of these discoveries represents both a triumph of chemical science, but also the beginning of the end for traditional herbal medicine in mainstream Western medicine. Because once you have pure morphine, why use crude opium? Once you have pure quinine, why bother with bitter cinchona bark tea? Pure compounds are more consistent, more predictable, easier to dose accurately. They are, from a scientific standpoint, better. But something is also lost. The whole plant often contains dozens or even hundreds of different chemical compounds, some of which might modify the effects of the main active ingredient. They might reduce side effects, enhance beneficial effects, or contribute therapeutic value of their own. When you use only the isolated compound, you lose these potential benefits. This is still debated today. Some scientists argue that whole plant preparations can be superior to isolated compounds. Others insist that purified drugs are more effective and safer. The truth is probably somewhere in between, depending on the specific plant and condition. But in the 19th century, as pure drugs became available, herbal medicine began to decline in prestige. University-trained physicians increasingly relied on purified compounds. Herbal medicine became associated with folk healers, midwives, and others outside the medical establishment. There was also a social dimension to this shift. In many places, the people who practiced herbal medicine were often women, poor people, rural people, groups with less social power. As medicine became more institutional and scientific, it also became more male-dominated and urban. Herbal knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women healers was dismissed as old wives' tales. This is not to say that all traditional herbal knowledge was accurate or effective. Some of it wasn't, but some of it was based on centuries of careful observation and contained genuine wisdom. The problem was that it was often dismissed wholesale rather than being carefully evaluated to separate what worked from what didn't. In 1860s Germany, the homeopathic Samuel Hahnemann developed a system of medicine based on using extremely diluted substances, often derived from plants. Homeopathy was controversial from the start and remains so today, with most scientists arguing that its remedies are too diluted to have any pharmacological effect. But it represented one response to concerns that heroic medicine of the era, involving harsh purges, bloodletting, and toxic compounds like mercury, was often more harmful than helpful. In America, a movement called Thompsonian medicine gained popularity in the early 19th century. Founded by Samuel Thompson, it emphasized the use of botanical medicines and rejected the harsh treatments of regular physicians. Thompson published a book of herbal remedies that sold widely, and Thompsonian practitioners established themselves throughout the country. The eclectics, another American movement, tried to take the best from various traditions of medicine, including herbal medicine, homeopathy, and scientific medicine. Eclectic physicians used plant medicines extensively, but also tried to understand them scientifically. These alternative medical movements kept herbal medicine alive in America as it declined in academic medicine. They preserved knowledge of medicinal plants and sometimes even conducted their own research into herbal remedies. But by the end of the 19th century, the decline of herbal medicine in mainstream Western medicine seemed inevitable. Medical schools stopped teaching about medicinal plants. Physicians learned about purified drugs instead. The knowledge of how to identify, harvest, prepare, and use herbal healers was being lost. Or so it seemed.